What do you really know about Jesus? The shepherds knew something about Jesus. They knew that God had promised for hundreds of years that God would send a Saviour. And as they were out there watching their sheep that night, they didn't know it was going to happen that night, but they knew what God had promised because it was all written down in the parts of the Bible they had back then. The wise men knew that a king was going to come, and as they looked at the sky and they saw this star appear, they knew it was a sign of the promised king that God had promised would come to rule over the Jews. But there were many, many people in those days who knew nothing. They knew nothing about what God had promised, and of course they knew nothing about what was happening that night as Jesus was born and laid in a manger. And one important man who knew nothing about it, I'm going to invite to come to the front now. We've got Caesar Augustus somewhere near the back. Caesar Augustus was the most important man in many ways in the world in those days. He was the ruler over the Roman Empire, which stretched across Europe and across the Middle East, and Caesar Augustus thought the world of himself. And he knew nothing about what was happening that night in that stable. Caesar Augustus, I think you've got something to tell us. Thanks, Caesar Augustus. We'll let him go back to his seat. But Caesar Augustus had his plans, and he thought that it was all about him. He knew what he was doing. He had this plan to register all the people who lived in his vast kingdom and find out how much money they could pay him. But as a consequence of that, Joseph and Mary get up from their home in Nazareth. They travel 70 miles to Bethlehem. Mary's heavily pregnant. It's a long journey. It's not a comfortable journey. They don't have a car. They don't have a train. They don't have an aeroplane. At most, maybe they have a donkey. But it's a long journey. They go to Bethlehem. And so it's there that Mary's baby, Jesus, is born. Now, Caesar had his plans, and he thought he knew what he was doing. But God had his plans. And God had had his plans for a very, very long time. We read earlier the prophecy from the book of Micah, where God had said hundreds of years before the birth of Jesus that out of Bethlehem would come a ruler. Out of Bethlehem would be a shepherd for God's people Israel. Someone who would rule and someone who would save and who would rescue people. God has said that hundreds of years before, and God knew exactly what he was doing. And as Caesar thought that it was all about him, God had a plan which was very different. A plan for God's king to arrive, for the Saviour that God had promised to be born. And so, Jesus is born, as we read in Luke chapter 2. He's laid in a manger, as we've got depicted for us so nicely here. Jesus is born, he's laid on a manger, and it's exactly where God had promised. It's exactly how God had promised. It's exactly when God had promised. And it's also for the reason that God had promised. What do you know about Jesus? Jesus was born to be king. And he was born to be the shepherd, to be the saviour of his people. Not just the people from Israel, but the people that he had all over the world, as we see today. Today we're in a world where people all over the world know something about Jesus. And also people all over the world, there are people all over the world who know and trust Jesus for themselves as their king and their saviour. Do you know what God promised? It's very important to know that, isn't it? The shepherds knew. The wise men knew something of it. That's why when they saw that star, they went, let's go to Bethlehem and see it for ourselves. Well, first of all, they went, let's go to Jerusalem. We'll find about them going to Bethlehem later. They said, let's go and see this for ourselves. Do you know that what God has promised? And do you know as well that what God's promised always comes true? It always comes true. We can see for ourselves that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, just as God said. It happened just when God said it would. But it also happened for the same reason God said it would, so that he would be the king and the saviour. So first of all, what do you know about Jesus? Then secondly, how do you hear about Jesus? How do you find out about Jesus? The shepherds and the wise men found out about Jesus in different ways, didn't they? And God did an amazing thing for the shepherds. Now, we've got various shepherds and sheep scattered around the church. And the shepherds and sheep are going to unite and show themselves to you, I think, at this stage. But God did an amazing thing to show the shepherds what had happened. The shepherds could just do a quick tour of the church and then come to the front, and we'll explain what happened to the shepherds. Oh, we've got some sheep as well. Come on, sheep. What noise does a sheep make? Come on, shepherds and sheep. Okay, the shepherds knew that God had promised a king, but they didn't know what was happening. And they were just going about their lives, the sheep following them and bleating. We've got a lot of shepherds, not very many sheep, haven't we? It's a good shepherd to sheep ratio here. If you're watching online, there are lots of shepherds and sheep parading around the church, but you can't see them. Sorry. Oh, look, here's a shepherd. We've got some shepherds and some sheep. They're coming to the front. You'll be able to see them in a second if you're watching. Whoa, lots of shepherds and a few sheep. Brilliant. Now the shepherds knew that God had promised a king, but they didn't know what was happening. Now, how did the shepherds hear about Jesus? How did the sheep hear about Jesus? Well, what happened was an angel suddenly appeared to them. Now, how would you feel if an angel suddenly appeared to you? What do you feel? It'd be quite amazing, wouldn't it? And it might be a little bit scary. So the angel appeared, and all the shepherds are terrified, all these scared shepherds. But what did the angel say to them? The angel said to them, "Fear not." He said, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Come on, stand up again. It's all right. It's all right. You don't need to be afraid, shepherds. The sheep don't need to be afraid either. Because," he said, "behold, I bring you good news of great joy." He said, this isn't scary news, it's not bad news, this is good news. And it's news that should make you really happy. Okay, instead of being scared, be happy, because here's really good news for you. He says, because today is born in the city of David the Saviour, who is Christ, that's the King, the Lord. He says, shepherds, you've been waiting for what God had promised. Well, now it's happened. Now he's been born, and he's in a manger there in Bethlehem. Go and find him. And so the shepherds heard about Jesus, and so they all went off to find Jesus. So you can go back to your seats now. Thank you, sheep. Take the sheep with you. We could do a sheepdog or two, couldn't we? What was it like? They were afraid because of the glory of God that shone around them when this angel appeared. The shepherds were aware that they were sinners. They couldn't stand before God and say, what great people we are. And they were suddenly aware of the wrong things they'd done. And the things which they'd done against God. But the angel said, don't be afraid. He hasn't come to judge them or even to tell them off. He's come to tell them about something wonderful that God's done for them. That God has sent a Saviour who is Christ the Lord. Now, this was really important information for the shepherds, but not just for them. It's important information for us today. And of course for all the people around at that day back then. And all the people who've lived in between. It's very important information for them because it's telling them and us that once again God has kept his promises. The shepherds were there waiting for a Saviour and a King to arrive, and now God has done it. Now the Saviour's been born. It's happened. And so the shepherds heard about Jesus and they rushed off to find him. They rejoiced, and the angels rejoiced too. They sang because God is a great God, and they could see what God was doing as God was keeping his promises. And when the shepherds heard about Jesus, they didn't just go back to their sheep and go, well, that was an interesting piece of news. Let's have a sleep. This has been quite a tiring event. Let's sit down and discuss it for a while. They realized how privileged they were to have heard this. And so they got up straight away and they rushed off to Bethlehem to see what had happened. And they found Mary and Joseph, and most importantly of all, Jesus, the baby, lying there in a manger. And they were amazed that God had chosen to tell them and that they'd be able to hear for themselves just what had happened. And so when the shepherds went and saw it, they in turn then went off and they told everyone else. They told everyone else what had happened. It says in verse 15, it says, when the angels went away from them into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, let's go over to Bethlehem and see this thing that's happened, which the Lord has made known to us. And they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in a manger. And when they saw it, they made known the saying that had been told them concerning this child. So they told other people, this is the Saviour, this is the King that God has promised. Because just like the angel said to them, this was great news of great joy, which would be for all the people. This isn't just great news for shepherds, it's not just great news if you happen to be looking after sheep, but there's good news, the angel said, for all people, for the whole nation of Israel, and for the whole world, because here finally is the Saviour, the one who can save us from sin and from death, the one who can be our King to lead us and to guide us through life and into eternity with him. Great news. And the shepherds understood that they should be telling other people about it. This was something other people needed to hear. How do you hear today about Jesus? How do you hear about Jesus? How do you hear about how God's promises have come true? Well, you don't have an angel suddenly appear to you, do you? I don't think anyone here has suddenly seen an angel appear to them and go, look, Jesus has been born. Because you don't need that. It is all written down for us here. The shepherds have recorded for us what they saw, and other people have recorded what they saw, so we can read it for ourselves. We hear from the Bible. We can read the records of what actually happened, and we can hear from other people. In the same way as people heard from the shepherds that night, we can hear from other people who have been changed by Jesus themselves as they've come to accept him as their Saviour and their King and been saved by him. So what do you know about Jesus, first of all? Remember, he's promised as the King and the Saviour. How do you hear about him? Well, not through a scary angel, but through what the shepherds and other people have told others to write down for us, and through other people who have discovered the joy of being saved by Jesus for themselves. Now we're going to go on from the shepherds, and we're going on to the wise men who we also read about. And we're going to look at finally, how can you find Jesus? How can you find Jesus? If you're looking in the Bibles, go over to Matthew. That's where we find the wise men, Matthew chapter 2. And after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the wise men arrived in Jerusalem, first of all. And they travelled a long, long way, nearly 1,000 miles perhaps, from the east. Now, some of our wise men got lost on the journey, but I think we've still got one left. So if our wise man would like to parade around, and he can come up to the front. So wise man towards the back of the church, if anyone's looking for the wise man. And then the wise man can come to the front and explain to us what he's been up to. I was due to be a wise man as well, but with James being unwell, I got demoted, so Lee is our wise man. Lee, do you want to tell us? Oh, we found another wise man, brilliant. Go on off to 2 wise men.
Nice sat nav break.
Tell us why you've come to Jerusalem.
We are seeking the King of the Jews. We've followed his star from the east. We've come a long, long journey.
Why do you want to find the King of the Jews? What's so special about that?
Because he's been promised. He's the Saviour of the world.
Oh, okay, that's exciting. So, thank you, wise men. Go off to Bethlehem and see if you can find him. So the wise men went off to Bethlehem to look for the promised king and saviour. But before they did that, they needed to find out where he really was. I gave them a shortcut that one there. I told them exactly where to look for him. But they had to ask around and try to find out where this king was. And when they asked around the city, and eventually they asked in King Herod's palace, Herod and much of the city with him were quite disturbed by this question. You imagine people turn up in the city and they start saying, "Where's the king?" And if someone came to you and they went, "Where's the king?" and you point them to Buckingham Palace and they go, "No, not that one, a different king." It's quite confusing, isn't it? What's this king they're looking for? Is there another king? Where's this other king come from? And Herod was very upset because he was the king. He didn't want any other kings around challenging his authority. Well, this should have been good news of great joy, just as the angel brought the shepherds. But it turned into a big problem for Herod and the people around him. Now Herod, while he was troubled and upset, he at the same time knew what God's promises were. He knew that God had promised a king. He knew that God had promised a saviour. But the problem with Herod was he didn't really want God's promises to come true. Herod went off and he got help from the scholars. He talked to the other wise men around him, people who knew the Bible and people who knew what had been written in the past. And they went back to that passage we read in the book of Micah. And they said, well, God's always promised it will happen in Bethlehem, that in Bethlehem a ruler will be born, one who will shepherd the people of Israel. And so Herod said, well, he's in Bethlehem. Go and find him there. Herod believed that God's promises would come true, but Herod had his own plans for his life. He had his own plans for his life, and he had his own plans of how the world should work and how it should revolve around him. So the first question really is less how can you find Jesus, and more do you want to find Jesus, I think. Because all of us can be a little bit like Herod. Herod was quite happy living his life. He was on top of the world, he was the king, everything was going swimmingly for him. He knew what God had promised. He knew God had promised a saviour. But he didn't really want to find Jesus. And eventually he only wanted to find Jesus in order to kill him. We can all be a bit like Herod. Do your plans for your life include rejoicing in what God's doing? Do you find that, like Herod, God's plans get in the way of your plans a bit? It can happen, can't it? God says do this, and you think, I'd rather do something different. We can all be a little bit like Herod. But what we find in Matthew chapter 2 is that regardless of whether we like God's plans or not, God still fulfills them, and he still carries them out. God still does exactly what he promised. Herod's anger and his frustration and his stubbornness, it doesn't derail God's plans in the slightest. And whether or not we like God's plans, that makes no difference to them, and whether God will carry them out. Now Herod, of course, came to a bad end. He was not a wise man, like Lee. Lee is a wise man. Herod was not a wise man because he didn't want his life to line up with God's plans. He wanted to live his life for himself. But the wise men did want to find Jesus. The wise men were important people back in their own country. They were probably very well regarded, very looked up to. But what mattered to them was finding the king that God had sent, finding the saviour that God had promised. They looked in the right place, they looked where God had told them, and they found him. And so they rejoiced. So Matthew chapter 2 again, verse 8, Herod said to them, "Go to Bethlehem, search diligently for the child. When you found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." Though of course Herod planned to kill him instead. But the wise men went. And it says to us in verse 10, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. These important men, they see Jesus, this baby, lying in a manger, and they fall down and they worship him. They rejoice with great joy, because they know that here at last is God's promise come true. Here at last is the true king. How did the wise men know how to find Jesus? Well, it was very simple, really, for them. They knew where to look because they knew what God had promised. They looked at what God had promised and they said, that's where he's going to be. And they went there and they looked for him. And they found him. They knew God's promises, they believed they were true, and they acted on it. How can you find Jesus? Well, Jesus is no longer in a manger somewhere in Bethlehem. How can you know Jesus for yourself? Well, it's very much the same as for the wise men as it is for us today. We can know what God has promised about Jesus. We can trust him that it's right. We can believe it's true. And we can act on it. We know who Jesus is because God promised who he'd be. That he would be the king, that he'd be the saviour, that he'd be the one to save his people from their sins. His birth really happened nearly over 2,000 years ago. His birth was a real historical event in answer to all those promises that God had made. God promised that he would be the saviour and the king, the one who would rule not only the nation of Israel, but the one who would be the king over the nations, the one who would save his people from their sins, the one who would be able to forgive us for the times when we're like King Herod and when we ignore God or go against him. And God's people today are like the wise men of that day. They're the people who've heard the news, they know what's happened, they've seen the evidence of that, they've read God's promises for themselves, and then they gladly receive them for themselves, accepting Jesus as their king, as their saviour, and rejoicing in that, because that is such great news for the world and for us as individuals. A great place to start is to start by getting to know God's promises. That's why it's so good to read the Bible, to know it, because it tells us who Jesus is, why he came, why that relates to us today. Well, it's not just an interesting historical event. We can start by getting to know the good news about Jesus in the written record that we have of it today. We don't need a message from angels. We don't need to travel 900 miles to find it out, because we have it here in front of us. And we can read for ourselves how Jesus was born, how Jesus lived, how he died, but he rose again on the third day, and how today he is reigning in heaven as the king, as the one that God had promised, and saving all those who believe and come to him